Hello everyone, NecroVMX here, and it's time for another SNES RPG review of Off the Beaten Path RPGs that I've played through for the first time on Twitch. This time I'm covering a Squaresoft RPG, one that was only released in Japan for the Super Famicom, Live Alive. Live Alive came out midway through the system's lifespan, and while it was rumored to be a target for localization, it never materialized outside of Japan. And after playing it, I can certainly understand the challenges that this one presented. Live Alive was developed and published by Squaresoft, and it failed to make a big splash on release. Instead, it got middling reviews compared to other RPGs, and the sales were low, which also scuppered its dev team's dreams of a sequel. Especially considering that Live Alive was likely an expensive game to make, as several well-known manga artists were contracted to work on the game, with each of the game's chapters having a different manga artist designing the characters, the enemies, and the locations. The basic premise of Live Alive is that you play through each of 7 chapters that are seemingly unrelated. Each takes place in a totally different setting, with a different cast of characters and a different feel. These chapters also span time periods, and each has its own gimmick. There's a caveman chapter with no spoken dialogue, a ninja chapter with a stealth aspect that keeps track of how many people you kill. There's a cowboy chapter that's all about creating and setting up traps to ensnare enemies, a contemporary setting wrestling chapter that is nothing but combat, a science fiction futuristic chapter that has no combat but is basically a take on the film Alien, a near-future chapter that is a take on Akira, and a kung fu chapter that's all about a master training the next generation of kung fu masters. Each chapter is like its own little game, complete with endings and credits, and once you beat all 7, it unlocks an 8th chapter, the fantasy medieval chapter, which then leads to the final chapter with all of the characters coming together. With so much unique about this game, it's really a wonder that it didn't catch on in Japan, although this may be because the game is so aggressively strange, and it got lost in the glut of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games coming out. This is also likely why the game wasn't released in the United States, as the humor can be over the top and sometimes sexual in nature. The game would have had to have been heavily censored for a North American release in the 90s, though today it's kinda tame. There is a translation patch made by Aeon Genesis, though if you're going to play the game that way, you may really want to make sure that you have the most recent version of their patch. If you had a patched ROM sitting around for ages that you just haven't gotten to, it probably has the older translation. That being said, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do have to address the importance of this game. Despite the game not being a hit either critically or commercially, the game's influence cannot be denied. The team that worked on Live Alive clearly loved this game, and the love and the passion that they put into it is obvious while playing it. The game's structure was kind of unusual for the time. It was based on a style of game called visual novel that's popular in Japan, but at the time they were mostly pornographic in nature. Hell, even today, most of them are. The idea of unrelated chapters being tied together in the end was intriguing to the team, so they decided to do it as an RPG, and of course, not as a porno, though as I mentioned, there's still a lot of sexual humor in the game. Pretty much right after the game's release, they started brainstorming at the ideas for a sequel, but they were denied by Squaresoft when they were told that the game didn't sell well enough to get a sequel. But if you know enough about Squaresoft, you know that they really never throw any ideas out, they just recycle them. And if you think of the concept of characters from different times coming together, and game worked on by famous manga artists, it's not hard to figure out what happened. The planned sequel wound up becoming Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is essentially the spiritual sequel to Live Alive, and the game's influence can be seen in a lot of other Square and Square Enix games. So let's get into the nitty-gritty, where I rank the game on a scale from 1 to 10 in 5 categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. And then I'll give you an average of all of them for the final score. As usual, I have to point out that I rank from 1 to 10, not 5 to 10 like most critics. Meaning, if I give a game a 5, that means it's average, not unplayable. A 7 is good, not average. I think I'm going to have to point this out every time, and I'll probably still get weird comments about it. For graphics and presentation, Live Alive, at least at first, almost looks primitive. The overworld sprites are tiny, and there's not a lot of detail compared to games that came out in the same year, like Final Fantasy VI or Breath of Fire 2, or even a pretty Genesis title like Beyond Oasis. That being said, while this game isn't exactly stretching the limits of the Super Famicom, you'll notice two things. One is that the overworld sprites, despite being tiny and undetailed, are shockingly expressive. There's a lot of animation here and a lot of visual humor, particularly in the caveman chapter, and it's done with the minimalistic graphics. Then, when you get into the battle screen, suddenly everything is drawn really well with a lot of detail, and you can see why they got manga artists to work on the game. This makes me believe that the undetailed lo-fi sprites used for the overworld are a stylistic choice rather than one born of limited talent or limited technology. Once you come to terms with this, Live Alive is a game that isn't impressive to look at on a technical level, but from an artistic standpoint it oozes a lot of charm. With the gigantic detailed bosses, great animations in battle for characters, and even the primitive overworld stuff is fun to look at due to the expressiveness that everything has. Live Alive is also very colorful and bright for the most part, and the character designs really stand out as memorable. Now, the in-game HUD is very easy to understand, though I did run into some weird text glitching. I'm going to have to assume that this was done by the ROM hacking team that translated the game, and honestly, I'm just grateful they did such a great job, so a few weird floating letters in the menu is a minor thing for me. While Live Alive's graphics won't ever win rewards, its presentation more than makes up for it. If I rank these separately, I'd probably say it has a 5 for average graphics and a 9 for awesome presentation, so I'll split the difference and give it a 7 for graphics and presentation. For music and sound effects, this game really shines. Every song is memorable and it's done really well. The sound effects really add to the gameplay. The sound is just generally the coolest part of the game by far. You know Toby Fox, as in the famous Toby Fox of Undertale, Deltarune, and who even got to write a song for Pokemon Sword and Shield versions? This game was a big influence on him, and his most famous song, Megalovania, before it was in Undertale or Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, it was in a ROM hack he did called the Halloween Hack for Earthbound. What he wanted to do was include a song from Live Alive called Megalomania, which is the final boss theme for every chapter except for the final one. This is a really, really awesome song, and Toby, running into technical difficulties getting it into his ROM hack, is what prompted him to write a song with a similar structure and name. So yeah, the soundtrack is not only great, but it's also heavily influential. What really sells it for me is how the sound team on Live Alive gets you to feel exactly what you're supposed to. The sad moments are sad, the funny moments are funny, the exciting moments are exciting, and as for the sci-fi chapter, the chilling soundtrack and especially the fantastic sound effects actually make it just as scary as the movie Alien that inspired it. For music and sound effects, Live Alive gets a 10. For story and writing, there's a lot to talk about because there's a lot of stories. Each story is told differently, so I'll mention the most unique sections. The Caveman chapter has no written dialogue. The characters use their expressions and body language along with emotes to communicate both to each other and to the player what they're saying, which is very impressive considering the limited overworld graphics. The most dialogue would be in the sci-fi chapter, which plays out like a horror story similar to Alien as an increasingly unnerving, but with dialogue and visual storytelling. Another standout would be the Kung Fu chapter, which goes from goofy to sad at the drop of a hat and becomes a very compelling story, and that really is the word for this game. Each chapter is very compelling. And after playing through the very different medieval chapters, seeing how it all comes together with all of these very different characters from very different backgrounds, it's highly compelling. It's effectively told. Certainly, this is one of the most unique stories from SNES or Super Famicom RPGs. Live Alive could be accused of being a game that tries to do too many things, however, it succeeds at all of these things. There's a lot of humor, a lot of heart, a lot of sad or tragic moments, and even some scares. Really, only the game's spiritual sequel, Chrono Trigger, did anything even remotely similar, and while this game isn't quite on the same level in terms of the actual story told, the way it's told is unique and intriguing. My only complaint would be that in the final chapter we don't get a lot of the individual characters' unique personalities coming through, but at this point you probably have bigger fish to fry. For story and writing, I give Live Alive a 9. For gameplay and controls, Live Alive is a unique beast in the way that it's so typical and yet so different. In some ways, it's like every other RPG. You walk around the overworld, you get into battles, you level up, you move the story forward. But this game has a few neat, unique differences to shake things up. There's no healing outside of battle since you start every fight at max health. There's no magic points. All skills can be used at any point for free, although some of them have a charge-up time. The battles are done on a grid-based system that seems like it's similar to RPGs like Fire Emblem, however your movement isn't limited. You can move your character around as much as you want before choosing an action, but taking too long may have your turn interrupted by an enemy attack. There is also no form of currency. All items are either found, gifted to you, traded, or, in the case of the near future episode, crafted. Each chapter plays like its own game with a unique thing to do in each chapter, such as Pogo the caveman sniffing out enemies, or the ninja's stealth, or the aforementioned crafting. There's trading, there's riding in mechs, solving a murder mystery, training kung fu students. There's a lot of variety to this game, and it keeps the actual gameplay pretty simple, but I think that works. For anyone looking for a break from the typical fantasy RPG, this can definitely scratch itches that you didn't even know you had, but at the same time, it still feels like a typical Square RPG. For gameplay and controls, I give Live Alive a 9. For balance and difficulty, well, this is kind of a hard one to talk about since there's a lot of variety here. Some chapters are definitely easier than others, and each challenges you in a different way. Enemies tend to level up with you, so as you level up, you'll start to run into stronger monsters, but leveling up isn't as important as you think it is, as each character will learn their ultimate technique at the low level of 16, and one character, the robot, doesn't even level up at all. There's very little in the way of grinding until the final chapter, as most chapters don't actually have random battles, and it's hard to actually get into real trouble in a battle since you start every battle at full health, and you can run away from any non-boss battle with no penalty. That being said, there are some difficulty spikes, mostly related to optional content near the end that you do if you want the best of the 4 endings in the game. I also found the sprawling maze-like dungeon of the ninjas chapter rather tedious, being a bit of a guide dang it, but for the most part the game is very fun and skews towards the easier side, and since in most variations of the final chapter you'll have 7 characters and you can only choose 4 to take with you at a time, there's a lot of different ways to tackle the endgame. Overall, it's a fairly well-balanced, easier RPG that has 1 or 2 guide moments, but nothing too egregious. I'll give Live Alive a 7 for balance and difficulty. Overall, Live Alive is a better game than Japanese critics of the time gave it credit for, possibly because they were playing it in the moment, in the same year as the more impressive Final Fantasy VI, and unaware of the amount of influence that this game would have. Reviewing it in the 21st century, it's kind of amazing to see how many ideas started here and how one tiny little unimpressive looking game brought forth so many ideas that we're still seeing today. It's a blast to play through, and it's both sad and understandable that this wasn't released outside of Japan. It's sad because I would have been all over this game, and it's understandable because it probably would have been butchered by the localization standards and censorship of the mid-90s SNES library. The overall score for Live Alive is 8.4, signifying this one as pretty damn great.